Julian had always been a creature of sound and motion. The slam of a car door, the gravelly laugh that echoed too loudly in quiet rooms, the restless drumming of his fingers on any available surface. My life, by contrast, had been curated for silence. The soft click of a turning page, the gentle hum of the refrigerator, the sigh of settling dust. For 10 years, our friendship had existed in the space between his noise and my quiet, a strange and stable equilibrium. I had learned to live with the low-grade ache of loving him, a feeling so constant it had become a part of my own internal hum, indistinguishable from the beat of my own heart. It was a manageable pain, a secret garden I tended in the most private corners of my mind. I was an observer by nature. It was my greatest strength as a graphic designer and my greatest weakness as a human being. I watched life happen, cataloging the details, the shifting light, the way a person's mouth tightened just before they lied. I had albums of Julian stored in my memory, a collection of moments he would never know I kept. Julian at 19, hair bleached by a summer spent lifeguarding, grinning at me over a bonfire. Julian at 22, face pale with terror and awe after his nephew was born, holding the tiny baby like it was made of spun glass. Julian at 25, impossibly handsome in a rented tuxedo at his sister's wedding, catching my eye across the dance floor and winking, a silent joke just between us. My life was a neatly organized file cabinet of these observations. It was safe. It was lonely. It was a life lived behind a one-way mirror, and I had long ago accepted that was all it would ever be. I had my work, my small apartment that smelled of paper and brewing tea, and my carefully managed crush on my very straight, very unavailable best friend. The routine was its own kind of comfort, a bulwark against the chaos of wanting what was so profoundly out of reach. Then, one Tuesday night in October, Julian dismantled my entire world with a single knock on the door. It wasn't his usual knock, a series of quick, impatient raps. This was a heavy, hesitant thud, like someone who wasn't sure they were at the right place. I opened the door to find him drenched, the city's autumn rain plastering his dark hair to his forehead and soaking the shoulders of his worn leather jacket. He smelled of rain, wet pavement, and whiskey. "She left," he said. His voice was a rasp, hollowed out. He wasn't looking at me, but at a point somewhere over my shoulder, as if the words were meant for the empty space of my hallway. Clara, of course, his girlfriend of 4 years, the woman I had politely smiled at during countless dinners, the woman whose name always felt like a stone in my mouth. I had watched their entire relationship unfold, a spectator at the parade of his life. I felt a shameful, ugly flicker of something that wasn't sympathy. I crushed it instantly. "Jules," I said, my own voice quiet. "Come in. Get out of the rain." He stumbled past me, dripping onto the worn hardwood floors I was always so careful about. He didn't seem to notice. He collapsed onto my sofa, the one I'd saved for 6 months to buy, and buried his face in his hands. His shoulders shook with silent, ragged breaths. The sound of his quiet devastation was louder than any noise he had ever made. I stood there, useless, my hands hovering in the air, unsure of the protocol for comforting the man you secretly loved when his heart was broken by someone else. I did the only thing I could think to do. I made tea. As the kettle began to whistle, a shrill cry in the heavy silence, I watched him. His jacket was pooling water on the gray fabric of the couch. His usual confidence had been stripped away, leaving behind something raw and vulnerable I had never seen before. He looked younger, lost. The scent of his jacket, that familiar mix of leather and something uniquely Julian, filled my small apartment, a scent I had caught in whiffs for a decade and always associated with a sharp, painful pang of longing. Tonight, it was just sad. He didn't touch the tea. He just sat there, staring at the steam rising from the mug I'd placed on the coaster in front of him. Hours passed. The rain stopped. The city outside my window fell into a muted hush. Finally, well after midnight, he spoke again, his voice thick. 4 years, Leo. I thought. I really thought she was it. He finally looked at me, and his eyes were bloodshot and swimming with a confusion so deep it seemed to pull all the light from the room. What did I do wrong? I am a good listener. It is the cornerstone of our friendship. I listen while he talks about work, about his family, about his dreams, about his girlfriends. I had always been the quiet harbor where he could anchor his thoughts. So I listened. He talked for hours, circling the same questions, the same moments of disbelief. I just nodded, murmured affirmations, and kept his mug filled with tea he never drank. It was around 3 in the morning when the conversation shifted. The whiskey he'd drunk before arriving had settled into a maudlin, philosophical haze. He was looking at his hands, turning them over as if he'd never seen them before. It's all about connection, you know, he slurred slightly. That's all anyone wants. To feel seen. She said she didn't feel seen by me. He snorted, a bitter, wet sound. Can you believe that? I saw everything. My heart twisted. I see you, I wanted to scream. I see the way you rub the back of your neck when you're stressed. I see the tiny scar above your left eyebrow from when you fell out of a tree at 12. I see the kindness you try to hide behind your jokes. I see all of you. But I said nothing. I was the observer. He fell silent again, but this time it was different. It was a heavy, thinking silence. He looked around my apartment, at my bookshelves organized by color, at the neat stacks of magazines on my coffee table, at the minimalist art on the walls. He looked at me, and his gaze was intense, analytical, as if he were trying to solve a puzzle. You're so different, he said, his voice low. You're calm. You don't need all this noise. It's just how I am. I mumbled, suddenly feeling exposed. No, it's more than that. He leaned forward, the scent of whiskey and rain suddenly stronger. You understand things. People. Without them having to say it, he paused, and his eyes dropped to my mouth. My breath hitched. My entire body went on high alert. This was new territory, a conversation we had never had. Jules, you're drunk, I said, trying to steer us back to the safety of our established dynamic. Maybe he didn't look away. Maybe I need to be. Clara said. She said I was a terrible kisser. The words came out as a wounded whisper. It was such an absurd, juvenile thing to say that it should have been funny, but coming from him, in that moment, it was devastating. It was a crack in the armor of Julian, the confident, charming man everyone loved. That's a ridiculous thing to say, I said, my voice firmer than I intended. She was just trying to hurt you. Was she? He looked at me, a strange, desperate light in his eyes. I don't know anymore. I don't know anything. He ran a hand through his damp hair, his movements slow and uncertain. I need to know. My stomach plummeted. I knew what was coming before he said it. A cold, terrifying dread mixed with a wild, forbidden hope. Leo, he said, and my name was a plea. Just one. For science. An honest opinion. Am I broken? The air crackled. The quiet of my apartment was suddenly deafening. This was it. The moment where the one-way mirror could shatter. He was drunk. He was heartbroken. He was my best friend. Saying yes would be a betrayal of our friendship, an exploitation of his pain. Saying no would be the most sensible, responsible thing I had ever done. He was looking at me, his face a mess of rain-streaked, tear-tracked, whiskey-fueled misery. And all I could see was the boy I had loved for a decade, asking me for something I had spent countless nights dreaming of. My sensible, responsible self screamed in protest, but the words that came out of my mouth were quiet, traitorous. Okay, Jules, I heard myself say. Okay. The space between us on the couch shrank. He didn't move so much as he leaned, a slow, deliberate shift of weight that felt monumental. I could feel the heat radiating from his body, could count the individual dark lashes surrounding his confused eyes. My heart was a frantic drum against my ribs. This is a mistake, my brain chanted, a frantic, useless mantra. This is a mistake, a mistake, a mistake. His hand came up, not to my face, but to my shoulder, his fingers gripping the fabric of my shirt. It was a grounding touch, as if he needed to make sure I was real. His gaze was locked on my lips. He was so close I could see the faint stubble on his jaw, the chapped texture of his mouth. Then he closed the distance. The first touch was hesitant, a soft, questioning pressure. It tasted of whiskey and rain and a deep, bottomless sadness. It was nothing like the kisses I had imagined. It was clumsy and wet and desperate. There was no passion, only a profound sense of inquiry. His lips were soft, softer than I'd expected, and for a split second, my body betrayed me. I leaned into him, a fractional movement, a subconscious response to a decade of pent-up longing. He must have felt it, that tiny shift, because he pulled back almost immediately. He blinked, his eyes unfocused. He looked even more lost than before. See, he whispered, his voice cracking. Nothing. He stood up abruptly, swaying on his feet. The moment was broken. The fragile, insane bubble we had created popped, leaving behind a cold, awkward reality. I should go, he mumbled, not looking at me. Sorry, that was weird. Forget it. He stumbled toward the door, grabbing his still damp jacket on the way out. He didn't say goodbye. I just heard the click of the latch, and then he was gone. I was left alone in my silent apartment, which now felt cavernous and empty. The only evidence he had been there was the damp spot on my couch and the lingering, ghostly taste of whiskey on my lips. The silence that rushed back in was different now. It wasn't peaceful. It was mocking. I didn't sleep. I sat on the couch, staring at the door, replaying the kiss over and over in my mind. It had been a clinical disaster, a drunken, miserable experiment that had proven nothing except the vastness of the chasm between us. I had taken something pure, my quiet, unrequited love, and allowed it to be part of his chaotic grief. The shame was a physical weight in my chest. I had crossed a line I had meticulously drawn and respected for 10 years. He had asked, yes, but I had agreed. I was complicit. The next morning, my phone buzzed with a text from him. My hands shook as I read it. Hey man, about last night. So sorry. I was a mess. Let's pretend that didn't happen. Still friends. My fingers hovered over the keyboard. Every part of me wanted to dissect the message. The casual, hey man, the dismissal. The desperate question at the end. I typed and deleted a dozen responses before settling on the one that would cause the least amount of damage, the one that would restore the equilibrium he had shattered. Of course. Don't worry about it. Friends always. I hit send, and it felt like a lie. It felt like I was locking a part of myself away again. But this time the room was colder, the door heavier. We were pretending it didn't happen. But I knew I would never be able to forget it. The quiet hum of my life had been replaced by a screaming silence. The weeks that followed were a masterclass in avoidance. We fell into a new, stilted rhythm. We texted, but the banter was gone. We met for coffee, but we sat with an invisible wall between us, talking about safe, impersonal things. Work, movies, the weather. Julian was trying, in his own way, to piece his life back together. He found a new, smaller apartment, a bachelor pad that felt temporary and sad. He threw himself into his work as a contractor, taking on extra projects, exhausting himself with physical labor. I watched him. It was what I did best. I saw the exhaustion under his eyes, the way he'd lost weight. I saw him trying to rebuild the persona of the easygoing, confident Julian, but the cracks were still there. He was quieter now. The restless energy was still present, but it was tinged with a new anxiety. He would start to say something, then stop, shaking his head as if to clear a thought. And I analyzed everything. Every pause, every glance. When he looked at me, did his eyes linger a fraction of a second longer than they used to? When he laughed at one of my dry jokes, was it genuine or forced? I was a detective at the scene of a crime, dusting for prints, searching for clues to a mystery I wasn't even sure existed. The ambiguous touches started subtly. At first, I thought I was imagining them. We were at a hardware store, picking out paint colors for his new apartment. He was holding up 2 swatches of gray, squinting at them under the fluorescent lights. Urban slate or storm cloud? He asked, his voice echoing slightly in the cavernous aisle. They're the same color, Jules, I said, my standard response to his indecision. He huffed out a laugh and turned to me, clapping me on the shoulder. It was a normal, friendly gesture, one he'd done 1,000 times. But his hand didn't drop away immediately. It stayed there, his thumb pressing almost imperceptibly against my collarbone for a beat too long. A tiny jolt, electric and warm, shot through me. By the time my brain had registered it, his hand was gone, and he was turning back to the paint swatches as if nothing had happened. I stood frozen, my heart doing a nervous flutter. Coincidence. I was reading into things because of what had happened. It was nothing. But then it happened again. A few days later, I was helping him move a heavy bookshelf into his new place. We were maneuvering it through a tight doorway, our bodies pressed close. Okay, on 3, lift your end and pivot left, he grunted, his voice close to my ear. We moved in unison, and for a moment, the back of his hand brushed against mine, our fingers tangling for a second in the cramped space. It was an accident, a necessity of the task. But his skin was warm, his calluses rough against my knuckles, and the contact sent another shockwave through my system. We got the bookshelf in place, and as we straightened up, breathing heavily, he met my eyes. There was a flicker of something in his expression, surprise, confusion, before he looked away and started talking about where to put the couch. These moments began to accumulate, a collection of tiny, charged accidents. Our knees brushing under the table at a diner, his arm pressing against mine in the tight cab of his truck, him handing me a beer and his fingers grazing my palm. Each time, my internal monologue went into overdrive. Did he mean to do that? Did he feel it too? Is this just how friends act? And I've forgotten what normal feels like. I was living in a state of hyper-awareness, my senses perpetually tuned to him. I was conscious of the space between us at all times, a magnetic field that seemed to hum with unspoken tension. I learned the rhythm of his breathing when he was tired, the way the muscles in his jaw clenched when he was concentrating. I was cataloging a new Julian, one who existed in the quiet spaces, in the ambiguous touches and the conversations that hovered on the edge of meaning something more. The real shift came one Saturday. I was at his new apartment, helping him paint the living room. It was a tedious, messy job, but it was comfortable. We had fallen into an easy silence. The only sounds the squelch of rollers against the wall and the classic rock station playing softly from a portable speaker in the corner. I was on a stepladder, carefully cutting in the ceiling line, my focus absolute. The scent of latex paint was sharp and clean. I felt a presence behind me, and then his voice, low and close. "You missed a spot." I turned my head, and he was standing on the floor right beside the ladder, much closer than I'd realized. His face was level with my chest. He was pointing to a tiny patch of the old beige wall, still showing near the corner. "Where?" I asked, leaning to see. "Right there." Instead of just pointing again, he reached up. His hand settled on the small of my back, a firm, warm pressure through the thin cotton of my t-shirt. My entire body went rigid. This was not an accident. This was not a brush of knees or a fleeting touch of fingers. This was a deliberate, placed hand. He used his other hand to guide my paintbrush to the spot. Just there. My breath was trapped in my lungs. I could feel the heat of his palm seeping into my skin, a focal point of searing energy. My own hand was shaking as I dabbed the brush against the wall. The world narrowed to that single point of contact. The music, the smell of paint, the room itself, it all faded away. All that existed was the weight of his hand on my back. He is holding me. The thought is a thunderclap in the quiet of my mind. It's not a supportive gesture to keep me from falling. It's a touch, a possessive one. My skin buzzes. I can feel the individual points of pressure from each of his fingers. He didn't move his hand away, even after I'd covered the spot. He just kept it there, his thumb stroking absently back and forth. It was a tiny, almost imperceptible movement, but to me, it was a seismic event. I couldn't speak. I couldn't move. I just stood there on the ladder, paintbrush in hand, completely undone by a simple touch. After what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 10 seconds, he cleared his throat and dropped his hand. The sudden absence of his touch was as shocking as its presence had been. I felt cold. "Thanks," I managed to croak, my voice sounding strained and unfamiliar. "No problem," he said, his own voice a little rough. He turned away and went back to his roller, the spell broken. But something had fundamentally changed. A line had been crossed, not in a drunken moment of grief, but in the quiet, sober light of a Saturday afternoon. He had touched me with intention, and I had let him. That night, I lay awake, replaying the moment. The firm pressure of his palm, the slow, hypnotic stroke of his thumb. It wasn't a question, like the kiss had been. It felt like a statement, but I had no idea how to translate it. My heart, which had been cautiously guarding itself, began to beat with a dangerous, fragile hope. The observer in me was terrified. The man who had been in love with Julian for 10 years was starting to wonder if, for the first time, he was being seen back. The painting of the apartment became our project. It was a neutral ground, a shared task that gave us a reason to be in close proximity without it feeling forced. We spent weekends and evenings covered in spattered paint, fueled by cheap pizza and warm beer. And in the process, the walls between us, the ones we'd hastily erected after that first night, began to crumble. It was during one of these long painting sessions that he showed me a new kind of vulnerability. We were done for the day, sitting on a drop cloth in the middle of the empty living room, sharing a pizza from the box balanced between us. The room was bathed in the warm, fading light of sunset, casting long shadows on the freshly painted gray walls. "It's starting to look like a real place," I said, trying to fill the comfortable silence. "Yeah," he said, but his voice was distant. He was staring at the wall, a strange, wistful expression on his face. Clara always wanted gray walls. My stomach tightened. We hadn't mentioned her name in weeks. It felt like a ghost had just entered the room. "I'm sorry," I said quickly. "I didn't mean to." "No, it's okay." He cut me off, turning to look at me. His eyes were dark in the dimming light. "It's just weird. I spent 4 years building a life around what someone else wanted. The restaurants she liked, the friends she had, the color of the walls. I don't think I ever stopped to ask what I wanted." He gave a short, humorless laugh. "I don't even know if I like gray." This was different from his drunken, heartbroken rambling. This was a quiet, sober admission of a deeper loss. Not just the loss of a person, but the loss of himself. "So what do you want?" I asked, my voice soft. He was quiet for a long time, staring at the pizza box. I thought he wasn't going to answer. Then he looked up, and his gaze was so direct, so intense, it felt like he was looking straight through me. "I want something quiet," he said, and the word hung in the air between us, heavy with unspoken meaning. "I'm tired of the noise, the drama, the performance." He gestured vaguely around the room. "I want something that feels real, solid. Like this." He tapped the hardwood floor with his knuckles. "Something you don't have to second guess." He was talking about his life, about his future, but his eyes were locked on mine. And in that moment, I felt like he was talking about us. About the easy, solid foundation of our friendship and the quiet, unspoken thing that was beginning to build on top of it. My heart ached with a terrifying mix of hope and fear. Hope that he was finally seeing what was right in front of him. Fear that I was misinterpreting everything, building a fantasy out of a few stray touches and one moment of philosophical introspection. "You'll find it," I said, the words feeling inadequate. He just held my gaze, a small, sad smile playing on his lips. "Maybe I already have," he whispered, so quietly I wasn't sure if I was meant to hear it. After that conversation, the tension between us became a constant, living thing. It was in the air we breathed in his small apartment, in the silences that stretched during long drives in his truck, in the way our eyes would meet across a room and hold for a beat too long. The subtext was now the main text. We were orbiting each other, caught in a gravitational pull that was growing stronger each day, and we were both too afraid to admit it. The tipping point came, as it often does, from an external force. Julian's sister, Sarah, was having a housewarming party. She was one of the few people in his life I genuinely liked. She had his warmth, but none of his chaotic energy. She had invited me separately, but Julian insisted we go together. "It'll be weird if we both show up alone," he'd said, a statement that was both practical and loaded. Easier to just ride together. The party was loud and crowded, everything I typically hated. But with Julian by my side, it felt manageable. He was a social butterfly, moving through the crowd with an easy grace, but he kept circling back to me, bringing me a beer, making sure I was included in conversations. At one point, he introduced me to one of Sarah's friends, a woman named Megan who was sharp and funny and, as I quickly realized, very interested in Julian. I watched him talk to her, watched him turn on the effortless charm that had always been his superpower. He laughed his big, booming laugh. He leaned in close to hear her over the music. And a bitter, possessive jealousy, ugly and unfamiliar, coiled in my gut. This was the Julian everyone else saw. This was the Julian who dated women like Clara and Megan. This was the Julian who was so far out of my reach. I felt the familiar urge to retreat, to fade into the wallpaper. I mumbled an excuse and escaped to the back deck, needing air. The cool night air was a relief against my hot skin. I leaned against the railing, watching the distant city lights, trying to calm the frantic beating of my heart. I was a fool, a complete fool for letting myself hope. The screen door slid open behind me. "There you are," Julian's voice said. "I was looking for you." He came to stand beside me at the railing. He wasn't smiling. His face was tense, his jaw tight. "You okay?" he asked. You just disappeared. Yeah, fine. Just needed some air, I said, not looking at him. Megan seems nice. The words tasted like acid. He was silent for a moment. She is, he said finally, his voice flat. She asked for my number. My stomach dropped. Of course she did. Are you going to give it to her? I asked, my voice betraying nothing of the storm inside me. I don't know, he said. He turned to face me, his body angled toward mine. The low light from the house cast his face in shadows. Should I? The question was a test. A direct, provocative challenge. He wasn't asking for my opinion as a friend. He was asking something else entirely. The air crackled, thick with everything we hadn't said for weeks. This was it. The moment of truth. I am a coward. I have been a coward for 10 years. But looking at him then, at the conflict in his eyes, at the way his hands were clenched into fists at his sides, I knew I couldn't be a coward anymore. No, I said, my voice barely a whisper, but it felt like a shout in the quiet of the night. His whole body seemed to relax, a tension I didn't realize he was holding releasing in a quiet exhale. He took a step closer. We were standing inches apart now. I could smell the faint scent of beer on his breath, the familiar smell of his laundry detergent. Why not? He asked, his voice low and rough. My heart is hammering against my ribs. My mind is screaming. This is the precipice. One more step, and there's no going back. The observer is dying, and someone else is taking his place. Someone who acts. Someone who speaks. Because I start, my throat dry. I swallow, and finally, I meet his gaze. Because I don't want you to. His eyes searched mine in the darkness, and I let him see it all. The decade of longing, the weeks of torturous hope, the terror and the want. I laid myself bare in that single, sustained look. He lifted a hand, and I flinched, expecting him to clap my shoulder, to break the tension with a friendly gesture that would shatter my heart. But he didn't. His fingers gently cupped the side of my neck, his thumb coming to rest just below my ear, right on the frantic pulse point. His touch was electric, definitive. Leo, he breathed, and my name was a prayer, a question, and an answer all at once. He leaned in slowly, giving me every opportunity to pull away. I didn't move. I couldn't. I was rooted to the spot, held captive by his touch and the raw vulnerability in his eyes. When his lips met mine, it was nothing like the first time. There was no whiskey, no grief, no desperation. This was soft. It was questioning. It was unbelievably gentle. A simple press of his mouth to mine. A moment of stillness where the entire world seemed to hold its breath. It was a kiss that asked 1,000 questions. He started to pull back, a shadow of uncertainty crossing his face. And the coward in me, the observer, finally died. In its place was a man who knew what he wanted and was terrified of losing it in the exact moment he might finally have it. Before he could retreat, before the doubt could reclaim him, my hand came up to fist in the front of his shirt, holding him in place. Keep going, I whispered against his mouth, the words torn from the deepest, most hidden part of me. A shudder went through his entire body. The sound he made was not quite a gasp, not quite a groan. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated relief. And then he was kissing me again, and this time, there was no hesitation. This time, it was deep and sure and hungry. His other hand came up to cradle my face, his thumb stroking my cheekbones as his mouth moved against mine with a desperate, pent-up energy that mirrored my own. It was everything. It was the 10 years of unspoken feelings, the weeks of simmering tension, the silent conversations, the accidental touches, all culminating in this one, explosive moment on a stranger's back deck. My mind went blissfully blank. There was no analysis, no overthinking. There was only the reality of it. The solid warmth of his body pressed against mine, the surprisingly soft texture of his stubble against my skin, the taste of him, the feeling of his heart hammering in time with my own. He deepened the kiss, his tongue tracing my lips, a silent request for entry that I granted without a thought. And when he explored my mouth, it was with a sense of discovery, of reverence. It wasn't the kiss of an expert. It was the kiss of a man who was mapping new territory and was terrified and thrilled by what he was finding. I felt a dizzying sense of rightness, a feeling of coming home to a place I'd never been. My hands moved from his shirt to his neck, my fingers tangling in the soft hair at his nape. pulling him closer until there was no space left between us. We were a tangle of limbs and frantic breaths, and the frantic beating of two hearts that had finally found the same rhythm. When we finally broke apart, we were both breathless. We rested our foreheads together, our chests heaving. The party music from inside the house sounded like it was coming from a million miles away. In our small bubble of darkness, the only sound was our breathing. "Leo," he said again, his voice thick with emotion. He didn't say anything else. He just said my name, but in it, I heard everything. I heard the confusion and the fear, but underneath it all, I heard the same sense of homecoming that I felt. "What are we doing, Jules?" I whispered, my voice shaking. He pulled back just enough to look at me, his hands still framing my face. His eyes were dark and serious. "I have no idea," he said, his voice raw with honesty. "But I don't want to stop." He leaned in and kissed me again, a short, soft, punctuation mark of a kiss. A promise. Then he took my hand, his fingers lacing with mine, a gesture so simple and yet so profound it made my breath catch. The rough calluses of his palm were a comforting, solid presence against mine. "Let's get out of here," he said. He led me through the house, our hands linked. I was vaguely aware of people turning to look, of Sarah catching my eye with a small, knowing smile on her face. But none of it mattered. The one-way mirror had shattered into a million pieces, and for the first time, I was on the other side of the glass, a participant in my own life. And it was terrifying, and it was wonderful. The drive back to my apartment was silent, but it was a different kind of silence than the ones we had shared before. It wasn't empty or awkward. It was full. It was humming with the energy of what had just happened, with the potential of what was about to happen. Julian kept my hand in his thumb stroking back and forth over my knuckles. I watched the city lights blur past the window, my mind a quiet, peaceful landscape for the first time in months. He parked in front of my building, but didn't turn off the engine. He just sat there, staring at the dashboard, his grip on my hand tightening slightly. The moment stretched, and the anxiety I had managed to keep at bay began to creep back in. Was he regretting it? Was the reality of it setting in? "Julian," I asked softly. He turned to me, and in the dim glow of the streetlights, I could see the turmoil in his face. "I'm scared," he admitted, his voice barely audible. The confession was so honest, so vulnerable, it disarmed me completely. "Me too," I said, and it was the truest thing I had ever said. He trailed off, shaking his head. "I've only ever been with women. I've only ever thought about women." He looked at me, his eyes pleading for understanding. "But then, there's you. And it's always been you, hasn't it? In the quiet, in the background. The only person who's ever really seen me." My heart felt like it was going to burst. "I see you," I whispered. I know a tear escaped his eye and traced a path down his cheek. He didn't seem to notice. And tonight, when I was talking to Megan, all I could think was that she wasn't you. That none of them have ever been you. And that scared the hell out of me. He took a deep, shuddering breath. "What does that make me, Leo?" I reached out with my free hand and gently wiped the tear from his cheek with my thumb. His skin was warm. "It makes you the man I've been in love with for 10 years, I said, the words finally spoken aloud. They didn't feel heavy or burdensome. They felt light. They felt like freedom. His eyes widened, and another tear fell. A small, broken sound escaped his lips. He leaned forward and pressed his forehead against mine again, closing his eyes. 10 years, he breathed. "God, Leo, why didn't you ever say anything? You were my best friend," I said simply. "You were straight. I didn't want to lose you." "You're an idiot," he said, but his voice was thick with affection. "You could never lose me." He pulled back and looked at me, a new resolve hardening his features. "I don't know what this is. I don't have a name for it. All I know is that when I kissed you, it felt right. More right than anything has felt in a very long time." He paused, his gaze unwavering. "Can that be enough?" "For now, it's more than enough," I said, my voice choked with emotion. He turned off the engine. The silence that filled the truck was peaceful. It was the silence of a decision made. He unbuckled his seatbelt, and I unbuckled mine. We didn't say anything else. We walked up the 3 flights of stairs to my apartment, our hands still linked. Inside, I flicked on a single lamp, casting the room in a soft, warm glow. It looked the same as it always did, my neat bookshelves, my quiet art, but it felt completely different. It felt like a beginning. Julian stood in the middle of the room, looking around as if seeing it for the first time. He finally looked at me, a small, nervous smile on his face. So he said softly, "What happens now?" And I, the observer, the planner, the man who always had a logical next step, had no answer. For the first time in my life, I was content not knowing. I smiled back at him, a real, genuine smile that reached my eyes. "I have no idea," I said, and I stepped forward and closed the distance between us. Waking up the next morning was a disorienting experience. For a moment, I was adrift in that familiar space between sleep and consciousness, aware only of the warmth at my back and the steady, rhythmic sound of breathing that wasn't my own. Then memory came rushing in, a tidal wave of sensation and emotion. Julian, the party, the kiss, my confession. My eyes snapped open. I was in my own bed, on my side, facing the wall. Julian was spooned behind me, one of his heavy arms thrown possessively over my waist, his front pressed against my back. He was radiating heat like a furnace. The slow, deep breaths I'd heard were his, puffing gently against the back of my neck. We had fallen into bed, a tangle of clothes and limbs and desperate, searching kisses. It had been gentle and clumsy and achingly tender. We hadn't gone all the way. It had been more about the profound intimacy of simply being allowed to touch, to explore, to hold. I had fallen asleep to the feeling of his heart beating against my back, a steady, reassuring drum. But in the cold, gray light of dawn filtering through my blinds, panic began its slow, icy crawl up my spine. Morning after clarity was a cruel beast. He was heartbroken. He was confused about his sexuality. I was his safe space, his constant. Had I just become another experiment? A rebound of the most complicated, catastrophic kind? The fear was a physical thing, a cold knot in the pit of my stomach. What if he woke up and regretted everything? I lay perfectly still, trying to control my breathing, terrified of waking him. I didn't want to face the conversation that was surely coming. I wanted to live in this small bubble of warmth and denial for as long as I possibly could. The arm around my waist tightened, and his breathing hitched. He was waking up. This is it. The panic intensifies. My heart rate spikes. I'm bracing for the inevitable retreat, the hasty apology, the awkward untangling of limbs. I stare at the grain of the wood on my bedside table, focusing on it, trying to ground myself for the impact. He shifted behind me, and I felt him press a soft, sleepy kiss to my shoulder blade, a gesture so tender and unconscious it stole the air from my lungs. He mumbled something incoherent into my back, and then his breathing evened out again as he drifted back to sleep. It was a small thing, a nothing thing, but it was everything. It wasn't the action of a man filled with regret. It was the action of a man who felt comfortable, who felt at home. The knot of fear in my stomach didn't disappear entirely, but it loosened its death grip. I allowed myself to relax into his hold, to accept the solid warmth of him against me. For the first time in a very long time, I felt safe. When he woke up for good about an hour later, it was with a slow, languid stretch that shifted the whole bed. I kept my eyes closed, pretending to be asleep, the observer back on duty, gathering data. I heard him sigh, a soft, contented sound. I felt him gently disentangle himself from me, the loss of his warmth immediate and acute. The bed dipped as he sat up. I listened to the sound of his quiet movements, the rustle of sheets, the soft pad of his feet on the floor. I expected to hear him gathering his clothes, the sounds of a hasty retreat. Instead, I heard the faint click of my bedroom door opening and closing, and then silence. He was gone. The panic came roaring back, 10 times stronger than before. He'd fled. He couldn't face me. I had been an idiot to read anything into a sleepy kiss. I had pushed him too far, and now I had lost him completely. My best friend. Gone. I curled into a ball, the sheets smelling faintly of him, of his soap and his skin. The silence of the apartment pressed in on me, heavier and more suffocating than ever before. I had had one perfect night, and now I was going to pay for it with a lifetime of loneliness. I squeezed my eyes shut, a wave of self-loathing washing over me. Then I smelled coffee. The rich, dark aroma drifted into the bedroom, completely at odds with my spiral of despair. I sat up, confused. I could hear faint sounds from the kitchen, the clink of a mug, the quiet opening and closing of a cabinet. He hadn't left. He was making coffee. I swung my legs out of bed, pulling on a t-shirt and a pair of sweatpants, my heart a confused, thumping mess. I walked out of the bedroom and into the living area. Julian was in my kitchen, his back to me. He was wearing his jeans from the night before, but was shirtless, his back a beautiful landscape of muscle and sun-kissed skin. He was moving around my small kitchen with a quiet confidence, like he belonged there. He had 2 mugs out on the counter. He must have heard me because he turned, a mug in his hand. His hair was a mess, and his face was still soft with sleep. He looked at me, and his expression wasn't one of regret or panic. It was hesitant, yes, but it was also soft. There was a warmth in his eyes I had never seen directed at me before. "Morning," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. He held out the mug. "I figured you'd need this." I took it from him, our fingers brushing. The jolt was still there, familiar and thrilling. "Thanks," I mumbled, my voice hoarse. I took a sip. The coffee was strong, just the way I liked it. He remembered. Of all the things to focus on, my brain latched onto that. He remembered how I took my coffee. The silence stretched between us, but it wasn't the unbearable, awkward silence I had been dreading. It was a waiting silence. A processing silence. We just stood there in my kitchen, sipping our coffee, looking at each other. He was the one who broke it. "I woke up," he said, his voice quiet. And for the first time since Clara left, I didn't feel empty. He looked down into his mug, then back at me. I felt okay. More than okay. He took a step closer, his eyes searching mine. "I'm still scared, Leo. I'm still confused. But I'm not sorry. Not for any of it." The relief that washed over me was so profound it made me feel lightheaded. I had to grip the counter to steady myself. "I'm not sorry either," I whispered. He reached out and took my free hand, his thumb stroking over my knuckles, just as he had in the truck. It was becoming his gesture, a gesture of reassurance. "Good," he said, a small, real smile finally breaking through his serious expression. "That's good." That morning set the tone for the days that followed. We were navigating a new world without a map. There was an undeniable awkwardness, moments where we would both go to speak at the same time and then fall silent, or where a casual touch would suddenly feel charged and significant. We were 2 best friends who had known each other for a decade, and yet we were learning each other all over again. The biggest test wasn't external. No one was gossiping. Sarah had sent me a simple, supportive text, and that was it. The test was internal, mostly for Julian. I would watch him when he thought I wasn't looking. I'd see him staring off into space, a thoughtful, sometimes troubled look on his face. I knew he was wrestling with it, with what this meant for his identity, for the life he had always imagined for himself. I gave him space. I didn't push for labels. I didn't ask what we were. I just let us be. We fell into a new routine, one that was a strange and wonderful hybrid of our old friendship and this new, fragile intimacy. We still watched bad movies and ate pizza on the floor of his now-painted apartment. But now, we sat closer. Now, his arm would be around my shoulders, or my head would be resting on his lap. Now, there were quiet, lingering kisses that were still filled with a sense of wonder and discovery. It was in these quiet, domestic moments that I saw the change in him solidifying. One evening, we were on my couch, watching some mindless action movie. I was half asleep, my head on his chest, listening to the steady, rhythmic beat of his heart. His hand was stroking my hair, a slow, repetitive motion that was incredibly soothing. "Leo," he said softly, his voice vibrating through his chest and into my ear. I murmured, not opening my eyes. "I think I'm starting to understand," he said. I opened my eyes and tilted my head back to look at him. His face was unreadable in the flickering light from the television. "Understand what?" "This," he said, gesturing between the 2 of us. "Me. Us." I spent so long trying to fit into a picture of what my life was supposed to look like. The job, the house, the wife, he paused. But the picture was always a little blurry. Something was always missing from it. He looked down at me, and his eyes were clear and certain. "It was you. You were what was missing." He leaned down and kissed me, and it was the most confident, self-assured kiss he had ever given me. It wasn't questioning or experimental. It was a kiss of declaration. It was a kiss that said, "This is real. This is what I want." That was the moment I knew we were going to be okay. The fear and anxiety that had been my constant companions for so long finally, truly, began to recede. They were replaced by a quiet, steady sense of peace. A few weeks later, on a crisp, sunny Saturday, Julian told me to pack an overnight bag. He wouldn't tell me where we were going, just to trust him. We drove for hours, leaving the city behind, heading north into the mountains. The further we got from the noise and the concrete, the more he seemed to relax. He was humming along to the radio, one hand on the wheel, the other holding mine. He finally turned off the main highway onto a winding dirt road. We pulled up to a small, rustic cabin nestled among a grove of pine trees. It was simple and beautiful, with a wide front porch and a stone chimney. "What is this place?" I asked, looking at him. "My grandfather built it," he said, a proud smile on his face. "It's been in my family for years. I used to come here every summer as a kid. No one's used it in a while." He led me up to the porch and pulled an old brass key from his pocket. He didn't unlock the door. He just stood there, holding the key, looking at me with that same serious, intense expression he'd had on the night of the party. "I told you I wanted something quiet," he said, his voice low. "Something solid. Something real." He held out the key to me, placing it in my open palm. His fingers closed around mine, pressing the cool metal into my skin. "This is the quietest, most real place I know." He took a deep breath. "I want to share it with you." I looked down at the key in my hand, then back up at his face. This was more than just a weekend getaway. This was an offering, a key to his past, and an invitation to his future. It was his conscious choice, his commitment, laid bare in a single, simple gesture. Tears welled in my eyes, but for the first time in my life, they weren't tears of sadness or longing. They were tears of overwhelming, incomprehensible joy. "Okay," I whispered, my voice thick. "Okay, Jules." He smiled, a wide, brilliant smile that lit up his whole face, and he finally unlocked the door. The cabin smelled of old wood and pine needles and disuse, but it felt like coming home. We spent the weekend cleaning it up, airing out the rooms, and building a fire in the old stone fireplace. We talked for hours, filling the quiet space with stories from our pasts, hopes for our future. We sat on the porch and watched the sunset paint the sky in fiery shades of orange and pink. We fell asleep in the old dusty bed, wrapped in each other's arms, the only sound the crackling of the fire and the whisper of the wind in the pines. The next morning, I woke up first. I slipped out of bed and made coffee on the ancient stovetop percolator. I took my mug out to the porch and sat on the steps, watching the sun rise over the mountains. The air was cold and clean, and the world felt new. A few minutes later, the cabin door creaked open, and Julian came out, a blanket wrapped around his shoulders. He sat down next to me, handing me a second mug of coffee, and wrapped the blanket around both of us, pulling me close against his side. We sat in comfortable silence, sipping our coffee, sharing our warmth, watching the day begin. I thought back to the man I had been just a few months ago, the quiet observer living a life of polite desperation, convinced he was destined to be alone. I had been so sure I knew the shape of my life, the boundaries of my own happiness. And then Julian, in his grief and confusion, had knocked on my door and kicked down all my carefully constructed walls. He had been the catalyst, the force of nature that had shaken me from my stasis. He had come to me looking for an answer to a question about a kiss, and in the process, we had found the answer to a question we hadn't even known we were asking. He leaned over and kissed my temple, his lips warm against my cool skin. "What are you thinking about?" he murmured into my hair. I leaned my head against his shoulder, looking out at the vast, peaceful landscape. The ache of unrequited love, the constant companion of my adult life, was gone. In its place was a feeling so calm and so profound, I didn't have a name for it yet. It was solid. It was quiet. It was real. "Nothing," I said, a smile spreading across my face. Absolutely nothing. And for the first time, it was true. My mind was quiet. I wasn't observing. I was just living. And it was more than enough. It was everything.